Well, it would appear that in light of the last publication, a further history lesson is needed. One of the things that is really important is that we understand history, and to understand it in context and not as some sort of rote thing that people try to remember. So, I want to talk about the Black Panthers, the Soledad brothers, and another assassination of a black leader. This revolves around the shooting of an inmate called George Jackson, and it's really relevant to what goes on from the Nixon administration on. I remember relating to one of my colleagues that I had some trouble getting through to some of my classes, and he said to me, what was the most defining aspect of your life? And I said, well, probably the assassination of John F. Kennedy. That defined my life from that point on. And he looked at me and said, your students weren't even alive back then, let alone know anything about it. So to me, it seems important that we know a little bit of history, particularly more modern history within the last century or so, to understand what's happening now. Now, earlier you heard me talk about Fred Hampton, the activist in Chicago. Well, in the 60s, it seemed like it was open season on just about any activist there was, and particularly black radicals and people like that. So we go back to the 60s. There were anti-war protests. There were the equivalent of a Black Lives Matter going back then. It was described and called Black Power. There was a Black Power movement. There was a Black Muslim movement. There was all kinds of various spin-offs, Black Socialists, Black Communists, Black Maoists, etc. All of the black movements that were against white capitalism and white privilege were considered to be communist inspired, and the government agencies reacted as such and acted toward them as such. So in the midst of that, in the 60s, there were several things that happened, one of which was the capture of hostages at Marin County Courthouse in California. They had a judge and a prosecutor and some jurors as hostages in order to free some black leaders that were incarcerated in Soledad Prison. That thing blew up. One of the persons capturing the prisoners was later killed. One of the activists was indicted for giving the weapons to the kidnappers. She was later acquitted. I'll come into that later. Anyway, when I met Kunstler and Lenny Weinglass and Hells Angels lawyer and Black Panther lawyer, etc. in Boulder, 1968, I also ran across a fellow named Steve Bingham. Steve Bingham was the attorney for a lot of public unions. He was a activist, a Lawyers Guild member, and he and I were somewhat simpatico. Anyway, about a year after the meeting, we had stayed in touch. He said he was coming to Colorado. He was going to go camping with one of the former presidents of the guild named Saperstein. They were going to go camping in the mountains. On his way here, he called and he said that he had just visited George Jackson and he had a lot of really dynamite things to tell me. Well, he never arrived in Denver. On the way to Denver to pick him up at the airport, I heard over the radio that he was wanted because Jackson was killed at the prison and he also shot a guard named Deleon, which was really an interesting turn of events. A shootout in the penitentiary with an inmate who happened to have had a gun. Well, the whole trauma or whatever of Steve Bingham became almost folkloric in its ramifications. They announced that he was seen in Michigan with Patty Hearst. He was supposed to have been with her. He was supposed to have been involved in many other things. All these were rumors, none of them really provable, but it went on with the narrative and continued the narrative of the black radicals and the white supporters. Bingham was particularly interesting because his father was Hiram Bingham, who discovered the Machu Picchu complex in South America. He was an anthropologist and fairly well known. In any event, a little while later, I got a call from Ramparts magazine. I had done some work for them in the past, along with a publication called Kudzu from Millsap College in Mississippi. They called and wanted me to represent a person who had been arrested in Boulder for some sort of theft charge. And they wanted me to get him bonded out, and they wanted me to be present with him when they interviewed him. Apparently he was the head of the White Nazi Party, or Aryan Brotherhood, in San Quentin Prison. He was released, and he had welded and built the interview cage for George Jackson. According to what he had told some people, was that not even a pencil could get through the wire mesh on the George Jackson cage. So it was very unlikely that Steve Bingham was able to pass a pistol through to George Jackson, which he concealed in a wig and used to shoot a guard. So this is the start of everything that was a substantial part of my life, or at least for 10 years after that. Well, I checked into the defendant that Ramparts wanted me to talk to and defend. He was held in lieu of a $500 bond, and Ramparts said they would send the bond money. Well, some church group intervened without me knowing it, and the bond was released or reduced to $50. And on the $50, the church group took the money from Ramparts and bonded the guy out. The problem was that Ramparts only sent $50 instead of $500 like they promised. So the defendant accused me of ripping him off for $450. He believed that $500 were sent, and the bond got reduced to $50, leaving $450 out there, which I pocketed, which wasn't the case at all. Ramparts heard the bond was reduced, and it was a PR bond, but it represented a 10% bond, and even then they weren't going to release the defendant without some form of collateral equal to $500. Anyway, he got out, called me up. I went and saw him that evening. He had a few drinks. He had a bottle of wine with him and commenced to tell me about his Aryan Nation thing and told me about George Jackson and the cage and all this kind of stuff. He had a theory. He said that Deleon, who was the guard that was murdered, was the leader of the Guards Aryan Nation, or White Nazi Party, and he had it in for George Jackson, and the Guards really wanted to get Jackson because he killed a guard allegedly earlier. So my client's theory was that the guards knew that this one guard was going to kill Jackson, and that some were sympathetic and against the white Nazi supremacists in the prison guard society, and decided, and they told Jackson when he was done with his interview, Deleon's going to get you today, and they slipped him a gun and said, take him out first. You might as well, you're going to be killed anyway, so take somebody with you, which is what he thought happened. Well, before Ramparts could get out there, we're sitting, and all of a sudden he's behind me with a knife to my carotid artery, not to the throat or anything like that, but clear back to the artery, which showed me that he knew what he was doing. He accused me of ripping him off and said he was going to kill me because I stole his money. I had no reason to doubt him at that time. He'd been a tough cookie. He'd been in prison several times, several years, and was a white Nazi. And I was a known socialist, so that kind of exacerbated things. In any event, I sat there and talked to him and tried to explain to him, and I said, look, right now, I'm the only one that's speaking for you, on your behalf. Now, you can believe me or not believe me, but I suggest you call Ramparts and ask just how much money was sent and who it was sent to and in what form, and things such as this, whether they sent me $50 or $500. I said, if you think I'm lying to me, you can go kill me tomorrow. But until then, you ought to at least confirm the rumor before you go sliding that knife, because once you slide the knife, there is nobody going to be for you, and nobody going to be helping you, and you're going to be in deep shit. Well, he thought that was logical in his drunken sense. So I went home, and he went somewhere to sleep it off. And the next day, he was arrested because he had stolen a public service cherry picker repair truck, and they'd caught him and rearrested him and denied his bail. So it was round two. However, he didn't seem to be confident of my ability to defend him because he broke jail with a guy named Manning later that day. And the next thing I heard was he had called Ramparts and he apologized, and he was on his way to Albuquerque to start the revolution, and could I join him down there? I said I'd get there as soon as I can, and thank for the call and good luck to him. And that was the end of that. So why am I describing it? Well, first off, it talks about some of the things I had to go through as a defense attorney, particularly representing people in the radical movement like the Panthers, the American Indian movement, Chicano movement, the United Mexican American Students movement, things like that. Minorities were always oppressed and felt they were oppressed and acted like they were oppressed, and very paranoid about anyone that was trying to help them. So, that's the point I'm trying to make here. And as a result of this, I was able to conclude that there's a lot of friction between blacks and whites even back then. You had some Klansmen, you had white Nazis, you had black radicals, brown radicals, etc., Indian radicals, and things haven't much changed. The only difference was that was 50 years ago, and everything is going on the same way today. You still have the same prejudice, the same bigotry, the same friction and antithesis or antipathy toward black people and other minorities. And the power structure here tries to portray it as a black and white matter, when in fact it's a socioeconomic matter. These people in power are against poor people. You can see that with the funding of the COVID-19. And they don't want to see poor people. And it just so happens most poor people belong to minorities. So it's easier to say, I'm against black people or black power or brown power or red power, whatever the hell it is, rather than say, you know, I don't like poor people. I don't want to share. I don't want to be altruistic. And they can go fuck themselves as far as I'm concerned. And this seems to be the majority view of white America right now. And the liberals feel somewhat guilty about it. So they deflect it on a racial basis. But think of this. As long as Martin Luther King was talking about black power, black versus white, he was allowed to live. However, he started getting concerned with economic matters of the black community. He went to Memphis to work with organizers of a union down there, the garbage workers. And what next thing we know, somebody whacked him. I think that had he not gone into economics and things such as that, that would have happened. But that's just my own personal opinion. In any event, I'll continue the Black Panther story at a later time. Thank you for watching.